It was one of those mornings that felt colder than usual, even for a winter day. The kind of cold that makes you want to stay under the covers just a little longer, sipping on hot coffee while watching your breath turn into tiny clouds. But this man didn't have that luxury. He had responsibilities, bills to pay, mouths to feed, and a life that demanded he showed up no matter how biting the wind was outside. The man lived in a small town called Maplewood, where everyone knew each other, but not much happened beyond the occasional festival or community bake sale. It was quiet, peaceful, and predictable. That morning, though, something unusual broke the calm. As he sat at his kitchen table finishing his breakfast, a simple plate of scrambled eggs and toast, he heard it. Faint screams, carried by the icy breeze slicing through the silence like a knife. At first he thought maybe it was kids playing some game near the park. Kids always found ways to laugh and shout, even when the weather tried its best to keep them indoors. But as the seconds ticked by, the screams grew louder, more desperate. Something wasn't right. His stomach tightened. Without wasting another moment, he grabbed his heavy coat from the hook by the door, pulled on his boots, and stepped out into the freezing air. The streets were empty, save for a few bundled-up neighbors hurrying to their cars. No one else seemed to notice the cries echoing through the crisp morning. He followed the sound, his boots crunching against the thin layer of frost covering the ground. Each step brought him closer to the source, and with every scream, his pace quickened. By the time he reached the park, his heart was pounding, not just from the run, but from the growing dread building inside him. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. There in the middle of the frozen lake were two children, a boy and a girl, both no older than 8, flailing helplessly on the ice. Their faces were red from the cold, their eyes wide with fear. They shouted for help, their voices trembling, as they clawed at the slippery surface beneath them. And then the worst part, the cracks. Thin, spiderweb-like lines spreading across the ice, threatening to swallow them whole at any second. People had gathered along the shoreline, pointing and whispering, but no one dared to move closer. Some held their phones up, recording the scene instead of stepping in. Others stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Fear hung thick in the air, paralyzing everyone except for this man. He didn't think twice. He couldn't afford to. Every second counted, and those kids were running out of time. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold sting his lungs, and started walking toward the lake. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He scanned the ice carefully, looking for the safest path to take. "Stay calm," he yelled to the children, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "I'm coming!" As he moved closer, the reality of the situation hit him harder. The ice groaned under his weight, protesting with every cautious step. He could feel it shifting beneath his feet, unstable and treacherous. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. What if he fell through? What if he made things worse? But then he looked at the kids again, their terrified faces, their tiny hands reaching out, and all doubt vanished. This wasn't about him. It was about them. Reaching the edge of the thicker ice, he paused, assessing the distance between him and the children. The boy was closest, gripping the edge of the broken ice with white-knuckled fingers. The girl was farther out, her body shaking uncontrollably as she tried to stay afloat. He locked eyes with the boy first. "Hold on tight," he said firmly. "Don't let go." With that, he stepped forward, testing the ice with each movement. Then, suddenly, it happened. The surface gave way beneath him, plunging him into the icy water below. The shock was instant and overwhelming. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing his skin all at once. His body screamed in protest, but he forced himself to focus. Pushing through the pain, he broke through the ice, swimming toward the children, with every ounce of strength he had left. When he finally reached the boy, he wrapped an arm around him and pulled him onto a patch of thicker ice. The child was crying, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, but he was alive. "You're okay," the man reassured him, his voice soft but firm. "You're safe now." Next, he turned his attention to the girl. She was struggling to stay above the water, her energy fading fast. Summoning every bit of determination he had left, he swam to her, pulling her close and guiding her back to safety. By the time he got both children onto solid ground, he was exhausted, his limbs heavy and numb from the cold. But there was no time to rest. He wrapped them in his coat, shielding them from the biting wind, and carried them toward the crowd waiting anxiously on the shore. Paramedics arrived moments later, rushing to tend to the kids. They were shaken but alive, thanks to the man who refused to stand by and watch. As the commotion died down and the paramedics took over, the man slipped away quietly, unnoticed by most. He didn't stick around for applause or gratitude. He simply walked home, his clothes soaked and freezing, his mind replaying the events over and over again. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, at least not in his own eyes. To him, it was just what anyone would have done. But little did he know, his actions that day would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The man trudged back home, his clothes still damp and clinging to his skin despite the layers he wore. The cold had seeped deep into his bones, but it wasn't just the physical chill that weighed on him. It was the emotional toll of what had happened. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, the terrified faces of the children, the sound of cracking ice beneath his feet, the way his body protested every movement as he fought against the freezing water. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie rather than real life. When he finally reached his small house at the edge of town, he closed the door behind him with a heavy sigh. His mother, an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair tied neatly in a bun, looked up from her knitting. She immediately noticed the state he was in, his soaked jacket, his pale face, and the exhaustion etched into his features. "What happened?" she asked, concern lacing her voice as she set her work aside. He hesitated for a moment before explaining everything. The screams, the lake, the rescue. He tried to downplay it, saying it wasn't a big deal, that anyone would have done the same thing, but his mother knew better. She'd raised him to be strong, compassionate, and selfless, but even she couldn't hide her worry. "You could have gotten yourself killed," she said softly, shaking her head. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to touch his arm. "Promise me you'll be more careful next time." He nodded, not because he agreed with her, but because he didn't want her to worry anymore. Truthfully, he didn't regret a single thing. Those kids were alive because of him, and that thought alone made all the discomfort worth it. Still, as he peeled off his wet clothes and wrapped himself in a blanket by the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Gratitude? Recognition? No, it wasn't about that. It was deeper than that. He just wished people understood how fragile life could be, and how important it was to step up when others needed help. The days that followed were quiet. Life in Maplewood went on as usual, with no one talking much about the incident at the lake. Sure, there were whispers here and there. Some folks mentioned seeing him pull the kids out of the water, but nothing came of it. No news articles, no ceremonies, no public acknowledgement. For most people, it was just another story to tell over coffee or during idle chit-chat. To them, it was over, forgotten. But for this man, it wasn't so easy to move on. Every time he passed by the park where the lake was, he glanced toward the frozen surface, remembering the weight of the ice giving way beneath him. He wondered if the kids were doing okay, if they were warm and safe at home with their families. He hoped they wouldn't remember the fear too vividly, that instead they'd grow up knowing someone cared enough to risk everything for them. Despite the lack of recognition, the man continued living his life as he always had. He worked long hours at the local garage, fixing cars for people who often barely acknowledged his efforts. Some customers left without even saying thank you, while others haggled over prices despite the hard work he put into repairing their vehicles. Money was tight, and bills piled up faster than he could pay them off. Yet, he never complained. He believed in doing honest work, even if it didn't bring fame or fortune. His truck, an old beat-up vehicle that barely ran, was parked outside his house, covered in rust and dents. It broke down more often than not, leaving him stranded on the side of the road more times than he cared to admit. Friends joked about how he needed a miracle to get a new car, but he laughed it off. A luxury SUV or a shiny sports car wasn't part of his reality. All he wanted was something reliable, something that wouldn't leave him stuck in the middle of nowhere when he had somewhere important to be. Little did he know, a miracle was closer than he thought. One evening, 3 days after the rescue, he was sitting in his living room watching TV when he heard a knock at the door. At first he ignored it, thinking it might be one of his neighbors borrowing sugar or asking for help with a flat tire. But the knocking persisted, louder this time. Sighing, he got up from the couch and opened the door, expecting to see a familiar face. Instead, he found a well-dressed stranger standing there, bundled up in an expensive coat and holding a briefcase. "Can I help you?" the man asked, confused. He didn't recognize the visitor, nor did he have any idea why someone dressed so formally would be at his doorstep. The stranger smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Hello," he said. "My name is David. I'm here because, well, let's just say I owe you a debt of gratitude." The man frowned, unsure of what the stranger meant. "I'm sorry. I don't think we've met before." David chuckled, lightly, clearly amused by the confusion. "We haven't, but I believe you've met my grandchildren." It took a moment for the words to sink in. When they did, the man's eyes widened in realization. "Oh," he said quietly. "Those kids?" "Yes," David confirmed, his expression softening. "The ones you saved from the lake. They're my grandchildren, and I can't thank you enough for what you did. You risked your life for them, and I'll never forget that." The man shifted uncomfortably, scratching the back of his neck. "It was nothing, really. Anyone would have done the same." David shook his head firmly. "No, not everyone would have. Believe me, I've seen enough in this world to know true courage when I see it, and what you showed that day, it was extraordinary." Before the man could respond, David reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Here's my number," he said, handing it over. "If you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to call me. Please let me repay you somehow." The man stared at the card, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to receiving offers like this, especially from someone he'd never met. "Thank you," he mumbled finally, "but I don't need anything. Really, I'm fine." David studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I respect that, but mark my words, this isn't the end of our conversation. You deserve more than just a thank you." With that, David turned and walked away, leaving the man standing in the doorway, still holding the business card. He watched as the stranger climbed into a sleek black car parked outside and drove off, disappearing around the corner. For a moment, he stood there staring at the empty street, wondering if the encounter had been real or just a figment of his imagination. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about what David had said. Was it possible that someone truly appreciated what he'd done? Or was it all just polite talk destined to fade away like everything else in his life? He didn't know, but one thing was certain. The world felt a little less lonely after that visit. The next morning, the man woke up to a world that looked exactly like it had the day before. Quiet, cold, and unassuming. He stretched groggily in bed, his thoughts still lingering on the strange encounter with David from the night before. The business card was sitting on the kitchen counter where he'd left it, its smooth surface catching the early light streaming through the window. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, examining the elegant font and the embossed logo at the top. It felt foreign in his grip, like something that belonged to another life. Shaking his head, he set the card down and went about his usual routine. He brewed a pot of coffee, fed his dog, a scruffy little mutt with soulful eyes, and got dressed for work. His old truck sputtered to life after a few tries, as it always did, and he drove to the garage feeling both grateful and frustrated. Grateful because the truck hadn't completely died on him yet, and frustrated because he knew it was only a matter of time before it did. At the garage, the day unfolded like any other. Cars rolled in and out, their owners dropping them off for repairs or picking them up after fixes. Some customers were polite, others less so. But he treated everyone the same, calmly, respectfully, and with a quiet determination to do good work. By noon, his hands were covered in grease and his back ached from bending over engines all morning. Still, he pressed on, knowing that every repair brought in money his family desperately needed. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began gathering, overhead, casting a gray pall over the town. The air grew colder, signaling another round of snow might be on its way. Just as he was closing up shop for the day, one last customer pulled into the driveway, a middle-aged woman whose car had been making strange noises for weeks. She apologized profusely for showing up so late, explaining that she'd been putting off the repair because funds were tight. He reassured her it was no problem, then got to work diagnosing the issue. An hour later, the car was fixed, and the woman drove away with a wave and a heartfelt thank you. By the time he locked up the garage and headed home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The streets were empty, save for a few scattered streetlights casting pools of yellow light onto the pavement. When he finally reached his house, fatigue weighed heavily on his shoulders. All he wanted to do was sit by the fire, sip some tea, and let the warmth seep into his tired muscles. But fate had other plans. As he approached his front door, something caught his eye. A gleaming black SUV parked right outside his house. At tree. First he thought it must belong to a neighbor or someone who'd stopped by briefly. But when he stepped closer, he noticed there was no one inside. The vehicle sat silently in the driveway, its polished exterior reflecting the dim glow of the porch light. Confused, he walked around it, inspecting it from every angle. It was brand new, sleek and undeniably luxurious, the kind of car he'd only ever seen in magazines or passing by on the highway. His heart began to race. What was this doing here? Who could it possibly belong to? Before panic could fully set, and he spotted an envelope tucked under one of the windshield wipers. With trembling fingers, he pulled it free and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. For the man who risked everything to save my grandchildren. This is just the beginning. There was no signature, but he didn't need one. He knew instantly who it was from. David, the stranger who had shown up at his door just days earlier. A lump formed in his throat as he read the words again and again, each time feeling a mix of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. How could someone just give him a car like this? It wasn't just a gift, it was a lifeline, a symbol of hope in a life that often felt suffocatingly difficult. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away quickly. Men like him weren't supposed to cry, especially not over material things. Yet this wasn't about the car itself. It was about what it represented: kindness, generosity, and the idea that maybe, just maybe, the universe rewarded acts of selflessness, even if they seemed small at the time. He climbed into the driver's seat cautiously, half expecting it to disappear like a mirage, but it was real. The leather interior smelled fresh, the dashboard glowed softly with digital displays, and the engine purred to life with a single turn of the key. For a moment he simply sat there, letting the reality sink in. Then, unable to contain himself any longer, he laughed. A deep, hearty laugh that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. It was a sound of pure joy, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. That night he called his mother into the living room and showed her the SUV. Her eyes widened in astonishment, and she clasped her hands together as if in prayer. "This is incredible," she whispered, tears glistening in her own eyes. "You deserve this, son, you truly do." He smiled, though a part of him still felt unworthy. "I didn't do anything special," he said softly. "I just did what anyone else would have done." His mother shook her head firmly. "No, you did more than that. You reminded people what it means to care for one another. That's rare, these days." Her words stayed with him long after she went to bed. As he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, he realized she was right. In a world where so many chose to look away, to ignore the suffering of others, he had chosen to step forward. And while he never sought recognition or reward, this unexpected blessing was proof that goodness didn't go unnoticed. Sometimes, it came back in ways you couldn't imagine. The following morning, he decided to take the SUV for a spin. It handled like a dream, gliding effortlessly over the icy roads as if it were made for them. Neighbors peeked out of their windows as he drove past, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright awe. He waved at a few familiar faces, chuckling to himself at how out of place the luxury vehicle looked parked in front of his modest home. But the man wasn't one to keep blessings to himself. As he navigated the streets of Maplewood, an idea began forming in his mind. This car wasn't just for him, it was an opportunity to give back even more. Over the next few days, he started using it to help those in need. He offered rides to elderly neighbors who struggled to get to the grocery store or doctor appointments. He delivered warm meals to families struggling to make ends meet during the harsh winter months. He even volunteered to drive kids to school when their parents worked early shifts and couldn't drop them off. Word spread quickly about the man with the shiny new SUV who went out of his way to lend a hand. People began stopping him on the street to express their gratitude, sharing stories of how his kindness had touched their lives. One woman tearfully told him how much it meant to have someone reliable to count on when her arthritis made driving impossible. A young boy shyly handed him a drawing of the SUV with the words, "Thank you," scrawled across the top. Each interaction filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Yet despite the attention, he remained humble. He didn't seek praise or accolades. He simply wanted to make a difference. To him, the SUV wasn't a status symbol. It was a tool, a means to reach more people and spread more kindness. And as he watched the smiles grow wider and the burdens lighten for those around him, he knew he'd found a deeper meaning in life. One evening, as he sat by the fire with his mother, she looked at him with pride shining in her eyes. "You've always had a big heart," she said. "Now you're showing the whole town what that looks like." He smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe," he replied, "but I think it's bigger than me. Maybe it's about reminding everyone that we're all connected, that we can all be someone's miracle." And with that, he drifted off to sleep, dreaming not of wealth or fame, but of a community united by compassion, one act of kindness at a time. As the days turned into weeks, the man's life began to change in subtle but profound ways. The SUV wasn't just a gift, it was a catalyst, sparking a ripple effect of kindness that spread throughout Maplewood. People started noticing him more, not because of the car itself, but because of how he used it. Whether it was driving an elderly woman to her chemotherapy appointment or picking up groceries for a single mom juggling 3 jobs, his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. At first, some folks were skeptical. They whispered behind his back, wondering if this sudden generosity had strings attached. "What's he getting out of it?" one neighbor muttered to another while waiting in line at the coffee shop. But those doubts quickly faded as stories about his selflessness piled up. A teenager whose bike broke down on the way to school found himself sitting in the plush leather seat of the SUV, listening to the man share advice about perseverance and hard work. A family stranded by the side of the road during a snowstorm watched as he pulled over, helped them fix their flat tire, and even gave them blankets from his trunk to keep warm. The town, once quiet and reserved, began buzzing with conversations about the man and his mysterious new vehicle. Kids pointed excitedly whenever they saw the sleek black SUV cruising down the streets, calling it the hero car. Parents smiled knowingly, recounting tales of how he'd gone above and beyond to help someone in need. Even the local newspaper caught wind of the story, sending a reporter to interview him for a feature article. When the reporter arrived at his house one chilly afternoon, the man greeted her with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the thought of having his photo plastered across the front page made him uneasy. Still, he invited her inside, offering her a cup of tea as they sat down at the kitchen table. She asked him questions about the rescue at the lake, the SUV, and why he chose to use it to help others. His answers were simple and heartfelt. "I didn't save those kids for recognition," he said, stirring sugar into his own tea. "And I'm not using this car to show off. I'm just trying to make things a little easier for people who are struggling." The article ran a few days later, capturing the essence of who he was, a humble mechanic with a heart bigger than most. It included quotes from grateful neighbors, snapshots of him helping around town, and a picture of the SUV parked outside his modest home. The headline read, "Local Hero Uses Gift to Give Back." By the time the paper hit doorsteps across Maplewood, everyone knew his story, and they couldn't stop talking about it. But fame wasn't something he sought or enjoyed. In fact, the attention sometimes felt overwhelming. Strangers would approach him at the grocery store, thanking him for inspiring them to be kinder. Others sent handwritten letters expressing their admiration, filling his mailbox with notes of gratitude. While he appreciated the sentiment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no different than anyone else. "I'm just doing what feels right," he told a friend one evening. "If anything, I hope this encourages people to look out for each other more." His humility only endeared him further to the community. Slowly but surely, Maplewood began to transform. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started reaching out, organizing food drives and clothing swaps for families in need. Local businesses pitched in too, donating supplies or offering discounts to customers facing tough times. What had begun as one man's act of courage had blossomed into a collective effort to lift each other up. One day, as he was leaving the garage after a long shift, a young boy approached him shyly. Clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, the child looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you the guy from the newspaper?" he asked hesitantly. The man nodded, crouching down to meet the boy at eye level. "Yeah, that's me. What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. After a pause, he held out the paper. "I drew this for you." Unfolding the sheet carefully, the man saw a colorful illustration of the SUV surrounded by stick figures holding hands. At the top, written in bold crayon letters, were the words, "Thank you for being a hero." A lump formed in his throat as he looked at the drawing. "This is amazing, Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Did you know heroes come in all shapes and sizes? You can be one too, just by being kind to others." The boy beamed, nodding eagerly before running back to his mom, who stood nearby watching the exchange. As the man got into the SUV and drove away, he couldn't help but smile at the memory. Moments like these reminded him why he kept going, even when life felt heavy and uncertain. Despite the growing admiration from his community, the man remained grounded. He still worked long hours at the garage, fixing cars for people who depended on him. He still lived in the same small house, sharing meals with his mother and playing fetch with his dog in the backyard. The SUV hadn't changed who he was. It had simply given him a platform to amplify the values he'd always believed in. Still, there were moments when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm him. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, he'd sit alone and reflect on how far he'd come. From the freezing waters of the lake to the polished interior of the SUV, his journey had been anything but ordinary. Yet through it all, one truth remained constant. True fulfillment came not from material possessions, but from the connections we forged and the lives we touched. His mother often reminded him of this. "You've always been special," she'd say, patting his hand affectionately. "Not because of what you have, but because of who you are." Her words stayed with him, guiding him through the highs and lows of his newfound role in the community. And though he never sought to be a symbol of hope, he embraced it wholeheartedly, knowing that his actions could inspire others to do the same. One evening, as he prepared for bed, he glanced out the window at the SUV parked in the driveway. Its glossy surface reflected the soft glow of the porch light, a stark contrast to the worn-down truck it had replaced. For a moment, he allowed himself to marvel at how drastically his life had changed, not because of luck or fortune, but because of a single decision to step onto thin ice and risk everything for two children he didn't even know. As he climbed into bed and closed his eyes, he thought about the future. There would undoubtedly be challenges ahead, moments when doubt crept in, or when the world seemed too big to tackle alone. But he also knew that he wasn't truly alone. The kindness he'd shown had sparked a chain reaction, weaving a web of compassion that stretched far beyond him, and in that knowledge he found peace. The man drifted off to sleep, dreaming not of accolades or rewards, but of a town where everyone looked out for one another, a place where acts of kindness, no matter how small, created waves of change. Because in the end, that's what mattered most, making the world a little brighter one person at a time. The weeks rolled on, and the man's life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. The SUV had become a part of his daily routine, not just as a mode of transportation, but as a tool to connect with people in ways he never imagined. Every morning he'd wake up early, brew a pot of coffee, and glance out the window at the sleek black vehicle parked outside. It still amazed him how something so unexpected could open doors, not just literal ones, but emotional ones too. Dogi. One particularly frosty morning, he decided to take a detour before heading to work. He drove to the edge of town, where a cluster of small, weathered houses stood along unpaved roads. This was where some of Maplewood's most vulnerable residents lived, families struggling to make ends meet, elderly folks living on fixed incomes, and single parents working multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. He'd been meaning to visit this neighborhood for a while, ever since overhearing a customer at the garage talk about how hard it was to get groceries during the winter, months when public transport wasn't reliable. Pulling up to the first house, he stepped out of the SUV and knocked gently on the door. A woman in her mid-30s answered, her face lined with exhaustion but her eyes warm and welcoming. She recognized him immediately. "Oh, it's you," she said with a tired smile. "What brings you here?" "I heard some folks around here might need a hand getting supplies," he replied casually, leaning against the car. "Thought I'd see if anyone needed a ride into town." Her expression softened, and she nodded gratefully. "That would be wonderful. My kids have been asking for milk and bread all week, but I haven't had time to go myself." By the end of the day, he'd made several trips back and forth between the neighborhood and the grocery store, loading bags of essentials into the SUV and delivering them to families who couldn't afford taxis or didn't own cars of their own. Each stop brought new stories: a grandmother raising 3 grandchildren after losing her daughter to illness, a young father trying to balance night shifts at the factory with caring for his toddler, a teenager helping her disabled mom navigate life without much support from anyone else. These were the faces of resilience, the quiet heroes of Maplewood who rarely got acknowledged. As word spread about his efforts, more people began reaching out, not just for rides or deliveries, but for advice, encouragement, and sometimes just a listening ear. One afternoon, an older man named Henry stopped by the garage clutching a worn baseball cap in his hands. He looked nervous, like he wasn't sure whether he should even be there. "I heard you've been helping folks around town," he said, hesitantly. Well, I was wondering if you might have a minute to talk." The man wiped his greasy hands on a rag and gestured for Henry to sit down on a stool nearby. "Of course," he said warmly. "What's on your mind?" Henry sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping under the weight of whatever burden he carried. "It's my wife," he admitted after a pause. "She's been sick for years, and I've been doing my best to take care of her. But lately it feels like everything's falling apart. Bills are piling up, and I don't know how much longer I can keep going." Listening intently, the man nodded, letting Henry pour out his frustrations and fears. When the older man finally fell silent, tears glistening in his eyes, the mechanic placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you think," he said softly. "And you're not alone. Let me help where I can. I'll check in on your wife, bring over some meals, maybe even figure out how to ease the financial strain. We'll get through this together." Henry left the garage looking lighter, as though a weight had been lifted, off his chest. Over the next few weeks, the man followed through on his promise, visiting Henry and his wife regularly, bringing groceries, and connecting them with local resources that could provide additional support. It wasn't grand gestures or sweeping solutions. It was steady, consistent care that reminded them they mattered. These interactions weren't always easy. Sometimes he came home drained, his heart aching from the pain and struggles he witnessed. Other times he questioned whether he was truly making a difference or simply putting band-aids on deeper wounds. But then he'd remember the smiles on people's faces, the hugs of gratitude, the way someone's entire demeanor shifted when they realized they weren't forgotten. Those moments kept him going, fueling his belief that even small acts of kindness could create ripples of change. One evening, as he sat by the fire flipping through a stack of thank you notes he'd received, his mother joined him, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. "You've done so much good," she said, her voice tinged with pride. "But tell me something, what do you want? For yourself, I mean." He paused, considering the question. Truthfully, he hadn't thought much about his own desires in a long time. His life had always revolved around taking care of others. His family, his customers, his community. Even now, with the SUV and the recognition it brought, his focus remained outward rather than inward. "I guess," he began slowly, "I want to leave things better than I found them. Not just for me, but for everyone." His mother smiled, her hands pausing mid-stitch. "That's a noble goal," she said. "But don't forget to take care of yourself too. You can't pour from an empty cup." Her words lingered in his mind long after she went to bed. He knew she was right. He couldn't keep giving endlessly without refilling his own reserves. Yet finding balance felt impossible when there was always someone else who needed him more. Still, he resolved to try, carving out moments of rest and reflection whenever he could. A few days later, an invitation arrived in the mail. It was addressed to him personally, written in elegant cursive on thick, creamy paper. Curious, he opened it to find a formal request to speak at a community event honoring local heroes. The organizers wanted him to share his story, not just the rescue at the lake, but everything that had happened afterward. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, and the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people made his stomach churn. But then he remembered the boy who'd given him the drawing, the neighbors who waved whenever they saw the SUV, the countless strangers whose lives he'd touched in small but meaningful ways. Maybe sharing his journey could inspire others to believe in the power of kindness just as he did. When the day of the event finally arrived, the man stood backstage, fidgeting nervously with the hem of his shirt. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation, filled with families, friends, and curious townsfolk eager to hear what he had to say. As his name was announced and he walked onto the stage, the room erupted into applause. Spotlights shone down on him, blindingly bright. But he focused on the sea of faces staring back at him, each one carrying its own hopes, dreams, and challenges. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. His voice trembled at first, but as he recounted the events of that icy morning at the lake, the fear he'd felt stepping onto the cracking ice, and the joy of seeing those two children safe and sound, his confidence grew. He talked about the stranger who'd shown up at his door with gratitude in his heart, the unexpected gift of the SUV, and the ripple effect it had created throughout Maplewood. Most importantly, he emphasized that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or extraordinary abilities. It was about choosing to care, even when it was inconvenient or scary. "When I jumped into that lake," he said, his voice steady and sincere, "I didn't think about being brave or selfless. I just knew those kids needed help and I couldn't stand by and do nothing. That's all any of us can do. Look out for one another, show up when it matters, and remind each other that we're not alone." The audience erupted into applause. Once again, but this time it wasn't just for him. It was for every person in the room who had ever lent a hand, offered a kind word, or chosen compassion over indifference. As he stepped off the stage, shaking hands and accepting hugs from grateful attendees, he felt a profound sense of connection, a reminder that true strength lies not in individual achievements, but in the collective power of humanity. Driving. Home that night, he glanced at the SUV parked outside his house and smiled. It had started as a gift, but it had become so much more, a symbol of hope, generosity, and the endless potential for good in the world. And as he climbed into bed, exhausted but fulfilled, he drifted off to sleep knowing that his story was far from over. After all, kindness has no finish line. It's a journey that continues one act at a time.